I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, once again, a guest we haven't had on for several months. We had her on when we brought up this book right here, All the President's Bankers. And we're talking about Nomi Prins. Nomi Prins coming to us from L.A. Nomi, how you doing?
I'm great, Greg. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, I'm gonna plug your book because it's all about what we're talking about today. Not just your book, but about the fast forward from your book. I mean, you wrote this book, All the President's Bankers. It goes back, to the turn of the century, the last century in the 1900s. You talk about all these presidents and their relationship with the bankers, and you have, tons of footnotes. It's a huge book. There you are. You've got 90 pages of footnotes and sources and stuff like that. You did really did a bang-up job on understanding the relationship between presidents and bankers, and I called you and said, can we fast forward to the day and find, what is Obama doing? What is going on with the Ukraine and this Middle East and the ISIS and what's going on? You said, I know what's going on. I'll be able to tell you what's going on. I'll noodle this. I'll get back with you. So I have you back on to talk about it. You sent me some research notes, and you talked about the gateways. Explain what Obama's doing in the Ukraine and the Middle East with what you're calling the gateways.
Yeah, well, what I call the gateways is the countries in the world in which political and financial strategy connect with respect to the United States, its bankers, how the U.S. has seen itself, has positioned itself from an expansionary position throughout the globe from a money perspective, and how it continues to do so. Some of that is steeped, actually a lot of that is steeped in some of the history that goes back to even before the Cold War period, but really can be seen around the Cold War period in Eisenhower's day when Cuba was a gateway country to Latin America and South America. That's where the U.S. wanted to be in control politically. That is where the U.S. wanted to be controlled from the standpoint of its private elite bankers. There were 11 branches in Havana before Fidel Castro came into power. And that was just the tip of the iceberg to gateway into that region with private capital, private expansion, take resources, and infiltrate. The Ukraine today is not dissimilar. Why do we care? Why have we cared about the Ukraine? We care about the Ukraine because it's a gateway to oil. It's a gateway to Eastern Europe. It's a gateway to continue our friendships with Western Europe and to control a situation politically, but also for our banking system to get involved from a financial perspective. One of the things that happened last week was Ukrainian President Poroshenko said that now, today, and the National Bank of Ukraine, their central bank, said as well that all of a sudden next year, they're going to be having higher growth after negative growth and all of these problems this year and before. Why? Because they're going to get on the side of the U.S. They're going to open their markets to more financial speculation. They're going to open their markets to austerity measures vis-a-vis the IMF and the World Bank that the United States predominantly controls and has already lent them $17 billion. They're in a position to take more, to borrow more private capital, and to use that private capital to continue to grow the country in the picture of how the U.S. and the IMF and World Bank and Europe wants them to grow the country. That's why Ukraine is important. It's a gateway politically and financially to that area of the world.
Yeah, could Russia and Putin, be a Castro to the party? Could they come in and is that what this is about? Then Russia's saying, whoa, wait, no, we want to control the Ukraine. We want the natural gas. We want the pipelines. We want that. That's part of us. We have could Putin play the role of Castro?
Well, he has been, in a way. He has a stronger military, of course, than Castro had. And what Castro did was he kicked out. He nationalized the U.S. bank interests at the time and other corporate interests that were coming in internationally. And he basically siphoned off the country so that he could have control over it. And, of course, we then slapped sanctions on him. And we still have sanctions on Cuba, which are really meaningless except kind of in sort of some historical, ideological dogma. Anyway, the bankers don't care about Cuba right now. They're busy in other locations of the world. When Fidel Castro is done and gone, they will care again. That thing will open, and it will be the gateway again to Latin America and South America. But in the meantime, there's been other gateways there. Putin's doing that, has understood that he needs to do that with the Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why, although there's been years and years of back and forth in that area with the Soviet Union, with Russia and the Ukraine, he understands it's a gateway as well. It's obviously a gateway for oil. It's also a gateway for the kind of banking system, the kind of capital from a private standpoint that can fester there. Russia backed a lot of the larger Russian banks before what has happened in the last year to grow and to expand in the Ukraine as well. So outside of the oil, also to fund infrastructure there, to fund what will be going on with respect to oil there, and to basically take over the role that European banks and U.S. banks were starting to have in the Ukraine. So there's very much a financial element there as well. The U.S. kind of has double-stepped him at this point, not merely because of the sanctions. I don't think it was because of that. Russia's big enough to deal with sanctions. It has enough other partners. It has enough resources to have dealt with the sanctions, certainly far more better than Castro ever could. I mean, Russia has a lot more going for it financially from that perspective. But the issue is Poroshenko did a turnover around. Him being in Washington to ask for more money in return for continuing to open up his country to the West, really, to U.S. and European interests, basically has taken some of the juice out of what Putin was trying to do and put it back in the arms of the U.S. And this is where the U.S. continues to remain powerful, is to use its political might with Europe, with itself, with its private bankers, with Europe's private bankers, to basically say, look, your country is going through some problems now. We'll help you. We already got the IMF to lend you $17 billion. There's another $19 billion coming. We'll get private capital in there through our private banking system. Listen to us. We'll make you look good. Poroshenko, of course, he's a businessman. He's a chocolate guy. He was on the council of the National Bank of the Ukraine. He understands money. And so right now, he is listening to the money of Washington, which is also the money of the private banking system, as well as its control over multinationals like the IMF and the World Bank.
Could this escalate into war? Could we have another Bay of Pigs where, we're the slaughtered pigs and, the NATO is the slaughtered pigs? Could that happen?
Right now, I think there's a little bit of less of a risk of that than there has been because of what Poroshenko's doing, because of his talks with Washington, because he's sort of given up the gamut. But if someone else comes into his place, if Putin realizes, look, I was in there for a reason. I am trying to siphon off the pro-Russian, etc., however it's called, Ukrainian components for a reason. That reason has to do with money, the power of money, not just political power, but financial power. And wait a minute, I'm losing that now. That could escalate what is going on in that region, and that could cause a potential situation. But that's also relative to what's going on in the Middle East and with oil in general. Now, Russia has backed pipelines to grow in Iraq. Lukoil, which is one of the largest, it's the largest oil company in Russia, one of the largest in the world, is involved in projects there that have billions of dollars of money attached to them. U.S. banks also see the potential for billions of dollars of not just oil money, but also financing, private financing, what's called project financing of the pipelines in Iraq. So that also can become a playing component in this situation. There's an $18 billion up for grabs pipeline project. Citigroup wants to finance that. Citigroup set up a bank in Iraq last year to be able to do that. Citibank has a $2 billion contract for Boeing airplane financing with Iraq. So there's a lot of other components in that region that are still in flux.
And I wanted to remind people, because this is a long time ago, but you still were an investment banker. You were a managing director at Goldman Sachs. So you were pretty high up in Goldman Sachs. So this is your ballpark, banking and now presidents and all that. And I'm glad you brought up the Iraq situation. I am just amazed, just following the overt news. I mean, you have have Dempsey, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, coming out saying, well, I think it's a great plan, which he's lying. He can't say my boss is an idiot. He has to say, oh, it's a great plan. But if it doesn't work, we'll be asking for boots on the ground. I mean, you have, Hagel, who's saying, and Dempsey also in another press conference a few weeks ago, this is the worst threat ever. Here we have this, we're going to arm. Now Congress has decided to vote to double down on this ridiculous strategy of arming, the moderate terrorists. We already tried that, and we armed Al-Qaeda, and that turned into ISIS. So, my what I want to say, and the president is repeatedly saying, even at MacDill Air Force Base last week, the end of last week, that, or the middle of last week, that no boots. I'm not going to involve you in another conflict in Iraq. A long question to say this: what is going on? This looks like a complete disheveled, kiboshed mess of Crazyville that won't work.
Yeah, it hasn't worked. Obviously, we've been on the ground in various parts of that region for over a decade, so it hasn't worked. It's created other terrorist factions, and the idea that we were sort of against Syrian President al-Assad, but now we're sort of going to back one aspect of the sort of Free Syrian rebels who don't like him but don't like ISIS more, and we're going to sort of get involved and somehow arm the right side and not create more friction. It doesn't make logical sense, but it doesn't make logical sense from a peace perspective. It does make logical sense from a financial perspective, because what can be done even in Syria, talking about another gateway, Syria is a mess. If the U.S. can get itself in there, and if that means financing or arming with some aspect, non-boots on the ground, later boots on the ground, whatever, of the conflict there, then the U.S. is also, as are its private bankers, in a position to fund the reconstruction of Syria, the reconstruction of Lebanon, the reconstruction of Jordan. The amount of money that Congress has okayed in this endeavor is peanuts. It's tiny relative to the billions of dollars that can be gotten in these redevelopment, reconstruction types of efforts. And that is something that no one's talking about in Congress, certainly not publicly. Obama may or may not even understand all the ramifications from a historical perspective in terms of the financing, but the bankers that run the largest institutions that can get money out of this, the World Bank and IMF, who basically make their role in the world by lending on the back of or in addition to private capital into these suffering areas in return for extracting resources, being involved in the oil, being involved in the project financing to get that oil. So there's money on all sides, not just oil, but in the financing of the extraction of it and the reconstruction of those countries. And I don't know that anyone's really talking about this aspect in the press. I don't know that Obama really fully gets it, but I do believe there are voices in his ears that are making these points behind the scenes.
But this banker plan that is going on in Obama's ear has a disaster, could be a potentially disaster component. This is not going to work. Dempsey is in Congress, and nobody thinks this is going to work. That we're just going to bomb them, and then not really all that much. He went from we're going to destroy, ultimately destroy, to well, it's not going to be shock and awe. It's not going to be, it's not going to be that much. And I think what he really slipped up and said about, the multiple points he made was he's going to try to manage this, which, here they're making videos that they're going to come after the White House, that they're going to come after America, that they're going to kill all these soldiers. They got him repeatedly saying, which he's doing himself, I'm not going to have boots on the ground. What could go wrong here with this plan that the bankers have in Iraq and Syria?
Well, again, it's private banking. It's also international banking. It's the idea of another place in the world that if it were to go right, there's a phenomenal amount of money on the table for all sorts, as well as changing and opening the region for financial deregulation. Now, what could go wrong is we get involved in another 5 or 10 or whatever year escalation of another area of civil war, of multiple factions, of terrorism in the area that we cannot possibly have control over. The fact that we're even at this point, that we're having this conversation, that the conversation in Washington is going on about ISIS, means we have no control over the situation. We have no control over that aspect of the situation. So to assume that to arm one faction against another faction, which has been something that the United States has been doing for decades in that region, trying to guess the faction that's going to be most friendly, and the faction that's going to be most friendly is the one that is supposed to support the opening of the area for financial and resource purposes, doesn't always work. And it often leads to heightened terrorism, as we've seen, heightened aggression against the United States and its citizens, as we've seen, not necessarily in our borders, but on the ground over there. And also a tremendous amount of death and bloodshed on the ground for populations there. I mean, these are populations that are dealing with the day-to-day effects of feuding factions within their borders, and in addition to not having the ability to control their economy, not having the ability to have a say in their futures, and we come in and make that unstable situation even less stable. So to think that we can do anything to fix it really is illogical. But again, I do believe that in the back of a number of people's minds, and particularly when you look at how bad the economy here is doing, it'd be lovely to have a multi-tens or dozens or hundreds of billions of dollar project going on there for 5 or 10 years if it did work. If it doesn't, though, there's more bloodshed, there's more problems, there's more, there's ongoing terrorism, and there's ongoing instability in a region that has historically been unstable and that historically we've never been able to control.
Well,
nor should we try.
The joining factor, again, is Russia and China. China is Russia's big partner now. And, Lavrov was talking about bombing in Syria, and hey, you better not be bombing our boy, Bashar al-Assad. No, I mean, are you worried about World War III starting in either of these locations or both at the same time, Ukraine and the Middle East?
Yeah, I think if something happens, it does join all of those elements, and it might not look like boots on the ground in one location. It looks like something that continues to evolve into some sort of a multi-pronged war across the Middle East, the Ukraine. These are areas, again, they're gateway areas, they're areas that everybody wants to control for resource purposes as well as for financial infrastructure purposes, and to change and open these countries in such a way that that's available to both Russia and China as well as to the U.S. in the future. And that's what's at stake here. And so China knows this, Russia knows this, the U.S. knows this, and it's a question of which factions win. Of course, the U.S. has Europe on its side, and that's been an issue as well. No one really wants to have a third world war. That's expensive and deadly. But at the same time, the actions that are going on here, this fighting over financial and political gain, is really continuing to crescendo. And it's crescendoing because there is so much money on the table, and because the economies involved, ours, Russia's, etc., are really all a lot weaker than any individual government wants to admit on the surface.
Do you think the economy continues to spiral down? Could we have a derivative moment where this thing just blows up? I mean, there's a lot of derivatives out there. Europe is doing terrible, and they're going to do worse because Russia's going to hit them with cutting off of gas supplies and jacking the prices up. I mean, are you worried about this spiraling out of control and having a greater depression?
Well, absolutely. Even if we look at the element that looks positive in this so-called recovery, which isn't a recovery for people, it's a recovery for markets. The U.S. stock market is obviously doing very well. The days it doesn't do very well, the days it's not at records, are the days when there's civil unrest, when there's some agreement that went wrong, when sanctions are imposed, when there's an element of the media that talks about a cold winter and not having enough energy supplies in Europe because of what's going on between the U.S. and Russia. So all of those things matter. All of those things do relate to a depression, because we're not even stable enough as it is. We haven't created enough jobs to make up for the population growth since the crisis in 2008, regardless of what the percentage numbers say. And most of us know that. What the market is growing on right now is merely going on now 6-year zero interest rate period. The same thing in Europe. The ECB has had rates down below zero. The UK, the Central Bank of England, is not going to be raising rates despite what they may or may not say sometimes, because they can't, because the only thing that's keeping any semblance of economic positivity up for corporations, for individuals, for markets, is the fact that money has no cost. If they can sustain that, it'll look a little better for a little bit longer, but the reality is that on the ground, the jobs aren't there, this is artificial, the money isn't funneling into the average citizens in any of these countries, and that creates instability, which is again why eyeing all these gateway areas becomes so important, because people know this. I mean, whether Obama's going to say it or not into the midterm elections or the next election or whatever, they know this. They know the economy is actually really weak. They know that the marks of positivity, I hope they know, otherwise they're really, really stupid, the marks of positivity are the result of no-cost money. And that has a shelf life. And so that's why all of these other pop-up gateway situations are occurring at the same time. There's a lot at stake here globally.
When do you think the shelf life, as you just said, that was a very important point, the cost of the no cost money has a shelf life. When's that expire? When's the party over? We're in the total end game phase of we got to do something else.
Well, I think it's going to be a while. You know, we're talking, I don't know, a year, 2 years, because the reality is that the Fed continues, as it did last week, to sort of say it might do something, but really we're not going to do anything with respect to interest rates. Now, they have said they're going to phase out, and they have been phasing out the bond buying aspect, but they didn't talk about it really last week. I mean, they're kind of stopping to talk about that. And what I've noticed is, and this is kind of an interesting byproduct of geopolitics and finance. China, for example, who is trying to do all these alliances and has been with Russia, is also trying to gateway into Latin America and South America more. There have been convoys of Chinese businessmen there, as there were with the U.S. decades ago. All of that's happening, but they're also buying our bonds. They're buying our bonds less, but they're buying our longer-term treasuries. And the reason they're doing that is kind of to make up for what the Fed isn't doing in QE, because they're sitting on a stockpile of $1.3 trillion of treasuries. And much as they would love to have probably nothing to do with our treasuries or our currency, aside from the trade that does work between our nations, they don't want to lose money on that amount of assets, and so they continue to buy in the part of the yield curve, which is why it's flattening, that they have on offer. And so the QE idea of going away really isn't. It's just kind of morphing into other buyers coming in instead of the Fed, while the Fed is able, and that's the only reason the Fed is able to continue to hold money down at zero. And so how long does that go? We have a pretty big yield curve. It's continuing to flatten. I mean, it could be a couple years. Or you could have a major shock, and there could be more unrest, more military operations, more things in the Middle East and in Russia that hurt the apple cart. But I think the Fed can continue to do this for a long time, and the fact that they've gotten the ECB and the Bank of England involved as well means you have basically two areas of superpowerness doing the same thing. This does hold up. It will stop. But I don't think it's going to stop tomorrow. I think the market's going to go more down on unrest and geopolitical issues and things happening at the same time. And, Citigroup not getting its $18 billion pipeline project financing deal, things like that happening at the same time, if they happen, that's more going to cause the market to come down. And then for us to see that all of this has been an artificially boosted situation.
And last question, what's so up with China buying all this gold? I mean, do they want to have the world's reserve currency and ultimately take control away from the U.S. and say, hey, we're going to have a gold-backed yuan, or is that a pipe dream?
I think they do, but I think that is also an issue of time. They're balancing having to deal with the dollar and they're pegged to the dollar with creating these alliances with Russia, with Latin America along the sides, and also buying gold, so that I don't know that gold becomes necessarily a reserve asset, but it certainly becomes something that they can control more because they own more of it. And if they can control more of something that the world considers a potential to be a reserve asset, that just helps them in the long game. It is a long-term game, though, because of the fact that they are tied, as is Japan, for example, another big trading partner of theirs, to U.S. Treasuries and the dollar.
Nomi Prins, thank you very much for coming on and connecting the dots with the gateways. I love it, and how the economies are so bad and everybody's fighting over the gateways because they know their economies aren't doing well. It's your book. It's still out and doing well. All the President's Bankers. It's online. It's on your site, and I'll be linking to that at the end of this interview, that you can buy it or go to your bookstore. All the President's Bankers. Very worthwhile read. Very interesting. Lots of, I didn't know that, moments in this book. Very good book. Nomi Prins, thank you so much for coming on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you so much, Craig.